we will be getting power cuts in the future. I think that varies from state to state. If you live in California, my answer would be yes. If you live in any other state, my answer would probably be no. And I'm assuming you're from the United States. If you're from Europe, obviously it's a much different question. Or if you're from Saudi Arabia, it's a much different question. Or if you're from Russia, that's a much different question. But assuming you're from the United States, and the future is a long, long time, by the way. So let's be more specific. Do you think we'll get power cuts in the next 3 years? Let's start with that one. In the United States, then outside of California, because California, it's almost a given. I don't know about power cuts, although if Russia cut off our supply of plutonium, that could do it. I wish I knew more about the infrastructure of the electrical grid in the United States, state by state, but I've discussed this to a certain degree with my good friend Rick Rule, and he always tells me that if you turn off the uranium to the United States, you're not going to be able to turn on the lights. So I know he's not saying that just for 100% of the population, but there would be a percentage there that would be included in your question. And if we keep poking China in the stick with an eye, or excuse me, in the eye with a stick, and they form an alliance with Russia, which I think is pretty probable, and if they're on the same team and we start a war with China over Taiwan, and then Russia says, okay, we're going to be on team China for obvious reasons. Probably not big fans of the United States, and we're not big fans of Russia right now. At least we'll talk about from a political standpoint. People are different. I'm just talking about the politicians. And therefore, why wouldn't Russia say no more enriched plutonium for the United States? Sorry. And I don't know what percentage of the world's plutonium is enriched in Russia, but it's a significant amount. I'm talking like 60, 70, 80%. And I believe we are one of their main customers. So, and even if we're not, they cut things offline, that price goes up and we get it, but we get it at a much higher price. So even if there aren't power cuts in the future, the power prices could be so high where effectively they are cuts because no one can afford to use the energy. There's always that. So I think in the next 3 years that there's a possibility there for sure that we need to be cognizant of. And I'm sure there's other black swans that I can't even think about because our power grid is so frail, because our energy policies are so stupid. And let's not forget, we're just draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. That's not a smart move by any stretch. And so what happens if we get caught with our pants down? What happens if, you know what I mean by using that saying, what happens if we get into a compromising position where it is a matter of national security and not just because we have midterm elections and Biden's trying to buy votes by getting the price of gas down? What if we actually do have a national emergency and we're dry? We don't have anything in the SPR. Then what happens to power? Then what happens to gas? Then what happens to distillates, diesel, right? And trust me, you'd probably rather have no power than no diesel. I'd have to if I had to choose between no power and no diesel, assuming that you could get the diesel into the trucks without power. I know there's a lot of layers and that gets really complex, but just at surface level, I would probably choose diesel over electricity because you can live without electricity. And people did it for a long, long time, but you can't live without food. And if you don't have the diesel, you don't have the food. So, because how are you going to get it? Right? You say, oh, George, well, the United States grows a ton of food. Yeah, okay. So what are you going to walk over to Kansas real quick and just go cut some wheat yourself? Go nuts. But, and I'm sure someone that's an expert could say, no, George, we'd rather have electricity because of X, Y, and Z. Like if I got my good friend Art Berman on, he might set me straight. But you see what I'm saying? My point is, don't discount the need for other things outside of simply just electricity when it comes to the need for energy, right? Now, as far as other countries, I'd have to do it on a country by country basis. But as far as 5 years in the United States, I think it's even more likely then because I think we'll have a central bank digital currency by then. And if we have a central bank digital currency, I think they'll start to allocate credit based on narrative instead of by merit. And the net result of that is going to be a massive misallocation of resources. And we've seen how that movie ends. We've seen how that plays out in China. We've seen how that plays out in communist Russia. When you get central planners trying to allocate resources, you get a scarcity of those resources. And if we have a scarcity of power or a scarcity of those resources because of the folly and the economic distortions and the mistakes of the authoritarians and central planners, then the people are going to feel it, and they're going to feel it in a way that's real, and that they're just not going to have access to power, or they might not have access to power at a price they can actually afford. And then 10 years, 20 years, I mean, that's so far off in the future. Who knows? Who knows? I think it gets more probable as we go throughout the decade, just because I think there's a high probability that the fourth turning has a lot of merit. And it's, in my opinion, this decade is going to be very tumultuous, and will probably get more tumultuous as we go into the latter stages. I was actually talking to Nigel about that, Nigel Farage, and he has the same, very similar view. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right. If I'm not, Nigel, I apologize.